Welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing the endocrine system. And the endocrine system consists of a number of different glands that work together to maintain homeostasis in the body. So starting from the top, we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Those are both in the brain, and we're going to have another video that discusses those next. We also have the pineal gland back here that regulates your sleep-wake cycles. We have the thyroid gland, which is at the front of the throat. And on the back of the thyroid gland are four tiny little glands embedded in it called the parathyroid glands. Also included is the thymus and the adrenal glands, which are like little hats that sit on top of the kidneys. The pancreas is a very important endocrine organ. And the gonads, which consist of the testes and the ovaries, which also produce hormones. So the endocrine system is composed of all of these endocrine glands. So what's an endocrine gland? Let's look at the difference between an exocrine gland over here on the right and an endocrine gland over here on the left. An exocrine gland is made out of glandular epithelium, and the cells are all lined up around sort of a central opening, and those cells are going to secrete product. The product will accumulate in this opening called a duct and will leave and be secreted onto some kind of body surface. So the product in an exocrine gland is secreted into a duct. And some examples of that would be the mammary glands, which secrete milk into a duct, and the milk is then secreted out onto the body surface. Another example would be a sweat gland. Sweat glands produce sweat. The sweat leaves through a duct onto the body surface. There are also some intestinal glands that secrete intestinal enzymes into the lumen of the small intestine. Endocrine glands are different. Instead of all of the glandular material surrounding an open area, which then leads to a duct, each of the cells of an endocrine gland are right next to the blood. So when they secrete their product, instead of it all coming together and being secreted out together, each cell is secreting directly into the blood. So all of those glands we just looked at here are going to secrete their product directly into the bloodstream. Now we just finished talking about the nervous system. And in the nervous system, remember, you have a neuron that has a long axon and a terminal end. When we're sending signals, we send an action potential, which we learn is an electrical signal. At the terminal end, we do have chemical signals that are released in the form of neurotransmitter, which is then picked up by either another neuron or some type of effector. These effectors can be either skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, maybe cardiac muscle, or glands. And so the nervous system has a very direct way of causing an effect. And we learned that action potentials travel very fast. They're also direct. So this gap between the terminal end of one neuron and the beginning of another neuron or a different type of effector is very, very small. So this is direct contact, almost. And the chemical signal here is a neurotransmitter. In the endocrine system, however, we have a gland that's going to produce a product directly into the bloodstream, which will then circulate throughout the body. Somewhere in the body is the target cell. So in Contrast to the nervous system where it was a direct stimulation, this is a very indirect stimulation, and it can take some time. So the endocrine system is slow, it's indirect contact, and the chemical signal that we're using, not called a neurotransmitter, it's called a hormone. So the nervous system is really quite different than the endocrine system. This being very quick to start and stop, having direct contact, and using neurotransmitters. The endocrine system is slow to start and slow to stop. It uses indirect contact because the hormone has to go through the blood to get to the target cell. And the chemical signal is called a hormone instead of a neurotransmitter. Speaking of target cells, one of the most important things for a hormone is that it only stimulates the target cell. Since hormones are secreted into the blood, and the blood goes everywhere in the body, we have to make sure that these hormones are very specific. Meaning they're only going to bind to the target cells that we want to activate. You can see here that our hormone is little round balls. This is our target cell. This is some other cell in the body that we do not want to stimulate. And you can see that the receptor on the target cell is ideally shaped to bind to our hormone, whereas other cells don't have the correct receptor and so will not be affected by the presence of the hormone. So when we're talking about specificity, it is whether the correct receptor on the target cell is present that's going to allow us to be specific with our results. There are 3 different mechanisms of hormone action, one of which is called the circulating hormones. And this is what I've been talking about so far. This is where the hormone is released into the blood, and they circulate throughout the whole body. This is the most common type of hormone. And you can see that here. Here's our endocrine cell. We're releasing the hormone into the bloodstream, and it's moving through the body and binding to any target cells that have the correct receptor. A second mechanism is called paracrine hormones. Paracrine hormones are hormones that are produced and locally diffuse around to bind to a nearby target cell. And our third mechanism are autocrine hormones. And these are hormones that are produced by an endocrine cell, and that hormone that is produced binds back to itself. So it's going to activate itself. Hormones can be one of 2 types. Imagine you have a cell, and remember the outside of the cell is that phospholipid bilayer. Sometimes hormones are what we call steroid hormones. The hormones of the adrenal glands, the testes, and the ovaries are steroid hormones. And remember that steroid, way back at the beginning of the course, steroids are a type of lipid. They are lipid soluble. And remember that our phospholipid bilayer allows lipids to move through it. So steroid hormones can actually diffuse through the plasma membrane of the cell. They bind to their target inside the cell. Sometimes it can be in the cytoplasm. Sometimes that target can actually be inside the nucleus. And they generally tend to turn on or turn off transcription and translation. Non-steroid hormones or peptide hormones are not lipids. They are generally made out of some kind of protein. Remember, peptide is a short protein. These cannot pass through the plasma membrane because they are polar and they are large. So instead, they bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. This causes some changes inside the cell, and activation happens via what's called a second messenger system. This basically means that instead of the hormone itself binding to the target, the hormone has to bind to a receptor, and the receptor activates something inside the cell to activate transcription and translation. So we have our two types of hormones here: steroid hormones, which are lipids and can enter the cell, and non-steroid hormones, which are not lipids and cannot pass through the plasma membrane and have to bind to a receptor on the outside of the cell. The endocrine system is very important in homeostasis. And remember, when we talked about homeostasis, we talked about how there was a stimulus, which is something interfering with some level of the body. The stimulus, the fact that there is a stimulus that is out of balance, is going to be picked up by a receptor, which will take information about the stimulus to the control center. The control center will make some kind of judgment about whether the stimulus is enough and what to do about it, and will send out instructions to an effector. And in negative feedback, the effector will go and do something to get rid of this stimulus and bring the body back into equilibrium. And a lot of the times people think of the control center as being the brain. But when we're talking about the endocrine system, there are some instances when the control center isn't the brain at all. It's actually one of the endocrine organs we just talked about. A lot of the time, this control center is going to be the hypothalamus. However, there are a few instances where the endocrine organ is one of the other organs throughout the body. And to finish this video, I'm going to be talking about those organs that are not involved in hypothalamus control. So the first one is going to be blood glucose level. So imagine this is the pancreas. The pancreas is the endocrine organ that is involved in controlling blood glucose levels. It does this by producing two hormones. When the blood glucose level starts to fall, the alpha cells of the pancreas are going to produce a hormone called glucagon. Glucagon stimulates the liver and other cells in the body to convert glycogen to glucose. So remember, glucagon is the hormone, glucose is a sugar, and glycogen is just a way that we store sugar for like a little bit longer term. So when glucagon is present, the liver is going to start converting that stored sugar, glycogen, into available sugar, glucose. It will release this sugar into the bloodstream, and it'll bring back our glucose levels to normal. However, say you had a big meal, and all of a sudden your blood glucose level starts to go up. So we have increasing blood glucose levels. The beta cells in the pancreas sense that the blood glucose level is going up, and they're going to release a hormone called insulin. Insulin acts on various cells in the body, and it encourages them to uptake glucose. So if these cells are pulling glucose out of the blood, it's actually going to lower the blood glucose level. It's also going to encourage those body cells to convert glucose to that stored version, glycogen. Doing this is going to reduce the blood glucose level in the body. So the fact that we have two different types of cells, beta cells and alpha cells, allows them to react independently and produce either insulin or glucagon. And this is how we maintain fairly constant glucose levels in our body, despite having times when we eat a lot of food and then times where we haven't eaten in many, many hours. Remember that glucose is very important because it's the only thing that the brain can use for energy. It cannot break down fats or proteins for energy. So we need to make sure we have a fairly stable amount of glucose in the blood or your brain starts to starve. Okay, so those are our first two hormones, and they are controlled by the same organ. Different cells, but the same organ, the pancreas. The next thing we're going to talk about that gets maintained during homeostasis is calcium levels. So the blood calcium level is very important. And unlike blood glucose levels, we actually have two different endocrine organs that help us with that. Say you just drank a huge glass of milk. Your calcium levels start to increase. We want to take advantage of that and store it as quickly as we can. The thyroid gland contains cells called parafollicular cells. They release a hormone called calcitonin. Calcitonin inhibits osteoclasts. And remember, osteoclasts are the cells that break down bone. So if you have high calcium and the thyroid gland produces the hormone calcitonin, that's going to inhibit those breaking down bone cells. And so we're going to actually increase the amount of bone that we're building. Whenever we're building bone, we're taking calcium and we're storing it in our bone bank, our skeleton. That's going to cause the calcium levels to fall as calcium gets stored in the skeleton. However, if that calcium level falls too far, it's going to actually stimulate another gland, the parathyroid glands. There are cells on the parathyroid gland called chief cells, and they're going to produce the hormone parathyroid hormone. This is often written as PTH because parathyroid hormone is long. So parathyroid hormone has a lot of different activities. The first thing that it does is it's going to cause the kidney to shut down excretion of calcium. So it's going to increase kidney reabsorption of calcium. So we're going to make sure that any calcium that might have been excreted in the urine is not going to be excreted. We're going to keep it in the body. We're also going to increase the release of something called calcitrol, which is active vitamin D. And calcitrol is released by the kidneys as well, different part of the kidneys. Calcitrol acts on cells in the intestine to increase the absorption of calcium from the digestive tract. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to increase the osteoclast activity. So get those bone breaking cells out there breaking down bone. This is called resorption. So a number of different ways to increase the calcium levels in the body, and it will come back up. Another level that is controlled by an endocrine organ is melatonin. Melatonin is created by the pineal gland. And instead of being created as needed, like insulin or glucagon, it's created in response to outside conditions. Melatonin makes you feel sleepy. This helps us maintain our circadian rhythms, which basically means that within a 24-hour period, we sleep for part of that period and we're awake for the other part of that period. In this case, the pineal gland is the effector that produces melatonin.
in response to environmental conditions outside the body.
So what happens here is your eye has light coming in and hitting the back of the retina. Those photoreceptors at the back of the retina not only tell you what you're seeing, but also tells the hypothalamus of the brain that it's daytime.
In those cases, the hypothalamus is going to tell the pineal gland to turn off the production of melatonin,
because you don't want to be sleeping during the day. However, if there's no light coming in,
the hypothalamus is going to tell the pineal gland to really increase that production of melatonin.
This is going to make you sleepy and make you want to go to bed. Now, melatonin has gotten a lot of press lately because of all of our phones and devices. The blue light from your computer screen or your phone screen wrecks melatonin. If you typically lay in bed and look at your phone or watch your laptop until you start to feel sleepy, this system is being disrupted. That blue light is actually wrecking the melatonin, as well as telling the hypothalamus that it shouldn't make any new melatonin. And so that sleepy condition is not going to come about very easily for you. The last endocrine organ I want to talk about in this video are the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands sit like little hats on top of the kidneys. And in particular, adrenal medulla is the part on the inside of the adrenal glands. We'll talk about the adrenal cortex in another video. The adrenal medulla produces two hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Instead of any of the cells in the adrenal medulla being the control center or the receptor, the control center is actually in the hypothalamus again. In times of stress, the hypothalamus is going to directly innervate the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla will secrete these two hormones. You may have heard of these hormones as adrenaline and noradrenaline. These are your fight or flight hormones. They serve to upregulate your stress responses in an emergency situation. Because they are secreted directly into the bloodstream, the adrenal medulla is considered part of the endocrine system, not the nervous system.
That's it for today. See you in class.